Alright, welcome back you guys. Today is going to be a short lecture video and I'm going to show you how to create an ambient occlusion render, and I'm also going to show you how to combine that with a typical render in Photoshop so that you can get a more composite, complete looking result. So what I've got here is a little scene that I've set up that contains a little bit of lighting, a little bit of texturing, and a camera which contains the exact angle that I'd like to view all of this from. Okay, so here's my camera created. If you want to get this little render screen on the middle of your camera, what you can do when you have your camera selected, just view selected to grab the camera that you're looking through, is to go down to View, Camera Settings, Resolution Gate. And then I also like to sometimes hit Overscan so that I can see everything around my render composition here. Alright, so this is the shot that I'm going to render. I'll show you what that looks like. I'm going to change the render settings here to be mental ray at quality, which is production, and I just want to make sure that ray tracing is turned on. Here it is turned on. Just preferentially, I like to also change this multi-pixel filtering to Lanxos because I believe it gives me a sharper image, although that's completely optional. You should play around with these filters to find out what you prefer. So here I'll just go ahead and hit render, and after a couple seconds I'll get my scene, and that's very much like what you're used to seeing, that we've got all the lighting and the bump maps on the surface of these materials and the textures and everything going on just fine. So I'm going to save that image, keep image here, and then I'm going to set up my scene so that I can make a ambient occlusion render. So I'm going to open up the outliner here, and you can see I've named all of my geometry objects. What you want to do is select all your geometry objects and leave out everything else. So you don't want to select your lights or your camera or your texture nodes or anything else. And then come on over into the channel box, and down at the bottom where we've got our layer system, you might have noticed at some point that we've got different types of layers. This is the display layer, which we've used so far just to template objects, turn objects on and off for visibility sake. Then we've got a render and animation layer as well. So click on over to the render layer, and then just like our display layers, we can go ahead and create a new layer from the selected objects by clicking either this button right here, or we can go layers, create layer from selected. Okay, so now we've got our master layer and our layer 1, which is the one I just created. Okay, so our layer 1 right now is identical to our master layer, only it doesn't contain any lighting. Let me see what happens if I render it right now. I think it'll look, yeah, pretty dull, completely black in fact, except for the carpet that has a little bit of ambient light on it, so not very exciting. What we want to do is use this for an override. Okay, so that it'll override our objects and give it a material which will allow us to do ambient occlusion. So I'm going to right click on this layer and then go down to override and then do create new material override, and in this long list over here I just want to pick a surface shader right up near the top. Okay, that turns the whole scene black because that's the default for a surface shader. I'm just going to hit the attribute editor button. Here's our surface shader, and I'll just name it Ambient Occlusion Shader. Okay. We're going to connect a texture node to the out color by clicking this checker box. Okay, and we're going to need to find a special type of shader that doesn't appear in this normal list. All of these words on the left hand side are categories, and then these buttons on the right are the particular type of node we could use. So we're going to use this search box up at the top. So first you need to click down here in the blank space below these categories so that we're searching through all categories simultaneously. And then just type in AMB, and this is the one we want. MIB, AMB, occlusion. Okay, so that's, actually I don't know what MIB stands for. I believe it's a mental ray shader, but ambient occlusion. Okay, so here we go. Now it's hooked up. I'm going to bring back my render view. It's still rendering from camera, by the way, so I don't have to worry about the fact that that's not in the proper scene view. I'm going to hit render, and what you see is a generally black and white, somewhat grainy image without any of our texture detail And it's also ignoring our lighting because it's creating shading using a very special method. So I'm going to save this one. So what's going on? An ambient occlusion render is one that measures the distance between faces on objects, and when it finds faces close by, it darkens that area. Okay, so the closer faces get to other faces, the darker that area is, such as beneath this sphere here. And then the farther away it is from other objects, the lighter it is. So up here at the top, this is a very light surface. And as you get down into crevices beneath things, beneath this archway, back towards the walls over here, everything gets darker and darker and darker. Okay, so this is great. We can use this to enhance our existing renders, particularly when the surface detail is very complicated. This becomes very helpful to show sculptural detail. But the quality is pretty low at the moment. Okay, so there's two things you should really be aware of. One, the samples number is what controls the quality of the grain. And the higher the number, the longer the render time will take, and the better the quality will be. From experimenting, I found something around 100 or so to be appropriate for this scene. Okay, so I'll try that. So here you can immediately see up in this corner a marked increase in the quality. Now you don't have to be very careful about quality if you're going to combine this later on as we are. Because I'm going to use this as an overlay in Photoshop, the particular grain quality here doesn't really matter because it's going to disappear entirely when we start combining it with other things. But as you can see, at about 100 samples or so, this is a really nice looking image. The second thing you have to be aware of is this spread number. The higher the number is here, the more the light will wrap around the object into the shadow areas. So if I change that from 0.8 to 1, oops, I'm going to get a slightly lighter scene. Okay, so a little bit lighter, a little bit more forgiving now. Not quite as harsh underneath. Your goal here for creating this ambient occlusion render is to get a nice middle kind of gray quality for most of the surfaces with whiter highlights around the brightest areas and darker darks around the most constrained areas, but without ever blowing out completely into pure black or pure white. You don't want that to happen because you've lost information at that point. And the whole reason we do an ambient occlusion render is to get more sculptural detail so that we can see the difference between different sides of the objects here. So I'm definitely saving that one. And we can compare that to our 16 samples, which you can see is pathetically grainy. Okay, much, much better there. The last thing I want you guys to be aware of is this maximum distance number here. Okay, that is used for giving a guess point for how far a surface should search for other detailed surface information. Now right now it's set to 0, which essentially means you should search infinitely. That's fine because my scene here is an open one. I'm making it look like it's an interior scene by placing walls down, but really it's open to the world, and so it's completely fine that I have 0 for that number. If this was an interior scene, that would not have worked. Okay, that would have created a purely black scene because it wouldn't have any guesswork. It would be searching infinitely and finding, oh, I'm completely enclosed, and therefore I should be completely dark. So just as an experiment right now, I'm going to change that number to something. As you can see, I've got Maya units on my grid there. So if I want to say something like, oh, 3 or 4 units, the maximum distance it's going to search is 3 or 4 units away from a object surface. Let's try, oh, not that number, this one, 4. And we'll render this again, and we'll see the difference. Okay? So I'm getting a much, much lighter render now because essentially as soon as the object is searched 4 units away, along its normal direction I want to say, and finds nothing, it assumes that it is as bright as it should ever be, and we get a very, very light render out of this. This can be fine if the only details you're concerned about are contact points, so we can use that. In fact, I'll go ahead and save that and we can compare it in Photoshop in just a little bit here. Did I save it? Yeah, I did. Okay, so you can see the difference between the two. but we're losing a lot of the high-end detail, a lot of the bright detail, which you may not be concerned with if you really only want to bring out all the contact points here. This could look very good. It's all down to preference. Let's turn this number up much higher though. The farther this has to look, the more likely it's going to encounter more information, and therefore the darker these objects will be. So I'll put this to 16, so 4 times farther than 4 units. And you're going to see we're getting a render much more like our original now. So 16 units is far enough away that we're essentially hitting all of the major important parts of our scene here. But it's not quite as dark as this one was, our infinite search. Okay? And as I increase that number, what I would expect to get is an increasingly more homogenized look, which is what this one is, very gray all over. So let's just try to turn this up to an extreme number like 500. There's absolutely nothing 500 units away from this stuff, to see if we can get a similar type of effect to our original render. And yeah, that's essentially what we get. Pretty much gray all over, with our lowlights preserved, but our highlights almost completely gone. Okay, so you can compare that one to that one. They're almost identical. All right, so this might be much more in the vein of what you would want for a render of this type. This could be an extreme example of something that you might prefer project to project, just to highlight contact points and to not really worry about the turning forms of things. So what we're going to do is we're going to save these images out and combine them in Photoshop. First, let me just show you that back in our render layers, you've got a couple buttons to be aware of and also a couple views. If you click on one of these layers, it changes your Maya view to show the materials for that layer and the objects. In fact, if you didn't include things like lights, they are now gone. Okay, but they are included in our master layer. If you want to make a fresh master layer render, you have to change this button down here. This is what allows it to render. That will turn layer 1 off. This one turned the master layer on. Now if I hit render, I should get my lit textured view. Okay? And when you get to more advanced uses of Maya, all of these things can be set to batch render to spit out animations and things inside our render settings. It does require a little bit of work and forethought, but you can make an entire video with ambient occlusion and master render and combine them in video editing software like After Effects. All right, so let's save some of these renders. I'll go ahead and just save this one because it's here. File, save image. I've already got a little working folder here. I'll just save them as JPEGs because it's easy to deal with that. I'll name this one my master render. Okay, and we'll pick a couple of these. In fact, these 3 should be great. This is more of our default occlusion, so save image, default, save image, medium, and save image bright. So we'll have a few to compare and contrast there. Okay, so that's it for Maya. I've got my renders out of it. All you're going to have to do in my class is to make occlusion renders that appear pretty much like this one to display your scene. Because for introductory modeling practices, we want to see that you know how to model things correctly. What you might notice about these objects is that I beveled the corners of these objects, so we got nice highlights, really soft looking, sort of playful objects here in the scene, and it helps for the contact shadows and the crevices inside of each of the contact points of the object. That's the type of thing that we want to showcase when you're in beginning modeling, because we need to know that you can control the polygonal modeling software properly before you go on to do more advanced things. Okay, but this next step where I'm going to combine them in Photoshop is really extra, something that you would do later on when you're more advanced and possibly done with a video editing software as well. So here I've got Photoshop, And you can use any image editing software that you prefer. Photoshop is just the one I have. And I'm going to open my rendered shots. Where did I put them? Did I put them in images? Ah, here we are. So here's all 4 of my rendered shots. I'm going to open them up. And you're going to get a warning in Photoshop. Pixel aspect ratio correction is for preview purposes only. Turn it off for maximum image quality. This is an annoying thing that happens when you spit out images directly from Maya. They squish them. And I'm not really sure why they think that this is an appropriate thing to do, but this is how you turn that effect off. View pixel aspect ratio correction, and it will turn it off. And I'm just going to do that for each one. And then we're all set. Okay, so I'll treat this one as my default image. I'm going to go into each one of the others and Control A, Control C to select all and copy, and then Control V to paste. And if you don't know how to use Photoshop, I strongly encourage you to look up some tutorials or take a class in Photoshop, because it is extremely useful for post-processing in 3D or even 2D development, painting, drawing, anything that you could want to do with images on the computer. So here I've got my 3 layers of occlusion and my base layer. Now take a look at the base layer just by itself, and what you might notice is that in the absence of those contact shadows, it looks a bit dull. And it might not be something you'd noticed up until this point, but it is something that's been present in Maya all along. The lighting is fairly nice. I took some time and made sure that I was careful with it, but even still, without these types of contact shadows and turning forms, it's not really that exciting. So we're going to try to combine these things together to make a more complete image. So I'm going to turn on my brightest occlusion render. It looks like that's my medium one. I'm just going to bring that one down here. I think I did them out of order, but I'll just make sure my darkest one's at the top there, my default. So here's my brightest one. And I tend to either use overlay or soft light as a blending mode for this layer. Sometimes you can get away with multiply. In this case, I might need to use multiply since it's so bright. But we'll start with soft light. Okay, that one didn't work so well. So you can see as I turn it on and off, what's happened is the colors in the image have become very milky because they're taking on the predominantly white colors of that layer and dulling down all of the colors. You can try to offset this by turning the opacity down, but really that milky quality is not going to go away. I'm losing the saturation of my colors, and that's a very bad thing. So let's try overlay instead. Turn that all the way back up. Okay, overlay is brightening my scene until it is blindingly white. So it's taking those white colors in that layer and pushing all of the brightnesses up until it becomes overwhelming. So neither one of those was particularly effective. Probably I tend to use those because the gray colors of these more typical occlusion renders don't combine that way and don't affect the other layers that way. So instead of either one of those then, let's just try hard light just for the hell of it. Oh, no, that's horrible. Okay, never mind. Let's try multiply. And I'll turn the opacity all the way back up for the test. So here is without the combine, and here is with the combine. And you can see the only thing really affected are the shadow areas. But what an effect. Oh my God, there's so much more detail that is visible suddenly with that layer turned on. Okay, we can see the corners of these walls as they come together. We can see the contact point of all of these cubes with one another. It is a little bit overwhelming though. So let's turn the opacity down a bit. Just until it's tasteful. 60% or so? 60% is looking fairly nice. We've got the shapes of the objects visible without it looking overwhelming, and when I turn them off, it really did not affect the tone of the scene much. It just gave us a bit more information. So that's a very successful combination, those two layers. Let's try the default before I go for this one, which I think is going to be the sweet spot. Let's try the default. A very gray image compared to our lighter image. So this time, soft light or overlay should work better. So let's try soft light. I can see a little bit of that gray effect while it's at 100, but I'll turn it down to about 50% here. And we're getting much the same effect as we did with the light render. There's still a little bit of graying of the colors here at the top of the sphere, a little bit of graying on the side of the blue block and on the walls. But if you didn't mind that too much, we're not really getting too much of a detrimental effect there. Let's try overlay. Overlay looks much better. Okay. With overlay, I feel like the colors are more rich for some reason, probably because the combination is making this saturated red look very deep and complex. If I turn this back up to 100%, how does it look? Wow, it looks like a over-contrasted image at that point. But I think that's pretty good, about 50% with an overlay combination is great. Let's just try and multiply for the heck of it. Instantly you can see the entire image became darker. Okay, I haven't even turned this up to 100% yet. At 100% it's a very, very dark image, so you can see that when you have an occlusion render like this one, which is predominantly middle tone gray, you don't want to use multiply. All it will do is darken your image down. It's not going to appear to be very attractive for it. So in this case, overlay at about 50% is the way we want to go. Let's just combine that, or just contrast that with our light render. So here's our light version and our dark version. And both have their pluses and minuses to them. If I had to make a choice, I think I would pick the light one at the moment for this particular scene because it's a light, airy kind of scene. If you had a horror scene or something, you might want to pick this darker occlusion and even turn up the contrast like that to get more of a dramatic effect or something. Okay, so let's try our middle render now. Here's our middle render. I'm going to first try soft light, 2 gray, just like our darker one. Overlay, very contrasted, but ooh, that's starting to look pretty nice. Right about 43% or so. That's a tough call between these two. I think I still prefer the lightest one because I'm getting more detail in the highlights on the ball. But it's not bad. It's not bad at all. Let's try hard light. No, I'm not sure what worked with hard light. I have an impression that hard light worked with something. I may be thinking of hard mix. No, I'm definitely not thinking of hard mix. Wow. Okay, well, if you wanted a sort of illustrated effect, maybe you could do something like that. Let's try multiply. And multiply has the danger of darkening the whole scene again, just like our dark render. Yeah, overall, you know, I feel like this one is the clear winner, the lightest render. I'll just show you that one more time uncombined. I feel like that's the clear winner because the important part so that we get the contact shadows and the places where things are closest together while eliminating most of the effect on the surfaces of the images to just a very, very small darkening as it approaches those corners. So yeah, I really did like this one the most, and that was just a multiply at about, what was it, 50% or so? Yeah, which tends to look like a very good combination. Okay, so that's it for this week, just showing you guys how to make an ambient occlusion render. We were going to make ambient occlusion pieces for mounting on the walls to show off your work. We're not going to make a video and we're not going to combine it in this way. I just wanted to make sure you guys had access to that information. All right, thank you very much and I'll see you next week.